A lot of my most memorable experiences in Cuba came along the Malecón. The Malecón functioned like a boardwalk would in America, but instead of the sound of carnival music and the smell of popcorn, you smelled cigars and heard the sounds of rattling engines rolling by. Early in the morning, fishermen would line the seawall next to the "No Fishing Allowed" sign and cast using their homemade rods and reel in brilliantly colored fish. One morning, as I walked toward the Malecón, I stopped at a corner near a small playground and was approached by a tall, slender Cuban man in worn clothing. Somehow he knew I was American, shouting, "Americano!" He began telling me that he was a teacher of English and French and Italian. Although his English was broken, it was still easier to communicate with him than it was any of the taxi drivers. As we talked, he pointed to a building across from us that had recently collapsed. The architecture in Cuba expressed great contrast, both in its actual color and in its reflection of the social constructs in Cuba. The homes of the wealthier of Havana, the dignitaries and the government officials, stood tall and had a stature similar to churches. The buildings in the city were similarly beautiful. The buildings were open, and from the roof of the home we ate our meals in, you could see down the street from the front, and from the side you could see the neighboring buildings. Almost every home had a balcony, and as I walked along one particular street, there was always a dog on one balcony that would bark at all passers-by. The homes that didn't have a balcony almost certainly had rooftop access, and though many of these homes were brilliantly designed and painted, an equal amount were crumbling. The Cuban teacher I had met told me that 4 buildings a day collapsed in Havana alone. Everywhere you walked, you could see skeletons of what used to be proud architecture. Cuba is a place of traditions and relics that have withstood time, the most apparent of those being the cars. Everywhere you looked, cars were from the 50s and 60s, and it truly gave the sensation that Cuba was a place that had been left in time. We took tours of Havana in classic cars, we drove along the Malecón, and we had to stop in the heart of the city for a funeral procession carrying a casket across the street. The cars we toured in were very well kept and maintained, but the cars an average person in Havana drove varied in condition. Though the engines may have been popping and rumbling, the paint was often fresh, and the homes lining the blocks of Havana were similar. Though the homes may not have been structurally sound, they often had a fresh coat of paint that made them pop with brilliant colors. Many of the streets in Havana looked similar. There were long blocks, and more often than not, it was people wandering the streets and not cars. It seemed like every street in Havana had its own stray dog. The street I stayed on, San Lazaro, had a resident dog who sat proudly on the corner every morning, fully willing to bite and chase any other dog that may have walked past it on the sidewalk. Cuba was a lively place. From the brew pub near the water to the rooftop bars, there was always something going on. The people of Cuba make America as a whole seem self-conscious. Everyone wore vibrant colors, and those who were unwilling to dance in a social setting drew a poor reaction from the locals. The music, whether it be religious ceremonial music or jazz music in the basement of a bar, made you move almost involuntarily to the syncopated rhythms. Art and music have a place in Cuba. And in a place where some forms of expression are limited, people conveyed their messages through graffiti. Throughout the streets of Cuba, you could find the works of Julier P. His alien depictions of people told stories of their own. Havana wasn't the only interesting place Cuba had to offer. We weaved up the mountains of Viñales, where we stopped at a scenic overlook, later scaling similar mountains in a tour bus to reach the city of Trinidad, also known as the City of Romance. We took a trip into the Cuban jungle in Soviet trucks, a bumpy journey described by our tour guide as the Russian back massage. We stopped at a waterfall where the mist was creating rainbows. We swam in a spring that was crystal clear and very cold. We smoked cigars fresh from a plantation, and we rode a powerboat through a cave. Overall, Cuba was a beautiful and brilliantly colored place.
All the Cubans that I met on the trip were very excited to see Americans and meet Americans, and even on the 9th day of the year, they'd say Happy New Year to us. The teacher that I met that morning on the Malecón went on to ask me for $20 for an inhaler. I told him I didn't have $20 I could give him, and he asked me if he could have a t-shirt for a souvenir. And I told him I'd go get one, but he said he didn't have time because his wife was having a C-section in the building behind us. So I don't know how true that was, but it was interesting that he was asking for a shirt because it's something that he needed. There's a lack of resources there, and hopefully with relations improving between the U.S. and Cuba, more opportunities and resources will come for the Cuban people. But I feel very fortunate to have gone to Cuba when I did because I know change is coming, so I'm very thankful for that.
Hola. Hola. Ah, gracias.